Welcome to Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership, the weekly podcast that features the very best in professional development and career planning in the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Patton McDowell, and happy to give you actionable ideas to elevate your current or perhaps your future nonprofit organization. Thanks for listening. I'm proud to have passed the 150 episode milestone and now moving into our next 150, as this is episode number 151. Thanks for listening. If you want to be a nonprofit leader or perhaps more effective in the role you're in now, you're in the right place. I'm glad to bring you these weekly conversations with nonprofit leaders who are on the cutting edge of our sector. And if you would, do me a favor, find the share button for this episode and share it with just one other person who's also on the path to nonprofit leadership. And we'll continue to build a global community focused on this kind of professional development and career planning. I had a fantastic conversation in this episode with Diana Zhang, who brings wonderful experience as the co-founder and CEO of a rapidly growing nonprofit called NeighborShare. Now, Diana is a wonderful example of what I would call a lateral entry into the nonprofit sector. She was a successful hedge fund manager for Bridgewater and Associates, which is a huge organization managing $150 billion. But Diana felt a calling, and she saw the challenges of many in her community that they were facing with a pandemic only exacerbating their challenges. Like many of you, she simply had to do something, and she, in fact, left her job and is now doing critical work in the human services arena in dozens of communities. And while her story is in and of itself impressive, she brings some great advice to this conversation for current and aspiring nonprofit leaders. And we talk about the challenges of a startup, how you have to seek community partnerships, how you can attract and sometimes release volunteers. And of course, she gets into the details of what it's like to be a lateral entry and what skills and experiences do in fact transfer from for-profit to nonprofit and what things she had to learn along the way. Lots of reasons to check out the show notes. This is episode number 151. Remember, you just have to go to the podcast or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you'll find out all of the resources that Diane and I discuss, as well as more information on the fantastic work she's doing through NeighborShare. Speaking of resources, go to our website and make sure you connect with us. We're on all of the primary social media platforms, including YouTube and especially LinkedIn. But make sure you also get on our email list so that you won't miss out on any of the resources we're putting together, including weekly podcast episodes just like this one. And by the way, love for you to check out my book, also called Your Path to Nonprofit Leadership. It is out in all of the primary retail outlets where you find books, both the print versions as well as electronic. Check it out. Love to hear from you, and I'm delighted at the response it's getting so far. Without further ado, please enjoy my conversation with Diana Zhang. Diana, thank you for joining me on the path.
Hi, Pat. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm equally excited for this conversation. We talked about this several months ago, and I'm so impressed with your work, and it, I know will add value to our listeners who are thinking about what a dream you fulfilled, literally. I think many professionals consider, how could I make an impact in the nonprofit world? You actually went out and did it. And so we're going to talk about that. Of course, I know some of the lessons you've learned already in your nonprofit management are going to benefit listeners who are also current nonprofit leaders. So thank you for being here. Let's jump into the first question. All right, you're a successful hedge fund executive for 15 years. What are you thinking, and why did you jump into nonprofit leadership?
Great question. This was frankly an unexpected leap of faith that I made during the pandemic.
Right.
Patton, basically what happened was, just think back to spring of 2020. And that was a period that I'm sure we all still remember probably much too vividly, right?
Yes.
It was right when, I know our company had just shut down, sent us home to work from home. We were still saying hopeful things like, Patton, I'm sure I'll see you in June at the latest. Like, they can't possibly be that long, right?
Right.
And then, at the same time, I remembered sitting at home with a growing sense of just frustration as I watched the headlines start rolling in. Like it was just 1 or 2 weeks into our communities closing down, and it was already the headlines hit with folks not being able to make bills, folks being at risk of being evicted. Like it's sort of the pandemic, I think, just almost overnight completely exposed the fragility that was always there in our communities. And I remember sitting there feeling this growing sense of energy and urgency to go do something about it. And then so basically what happened was, my initial co-founders and I sort of got together because they similarly felt this energy, and sort of like, like using a spark of an idea that my co-founder had, like we sort of like just started building out NeighborShare. We thought that that could be a great sort of like impactful and innovative way to bring help to our communities in the way that we felt so strongly about. And then basically, long story short, as things started to pick up steam throughout 2020, I just, grew more and more passionate about it. We were still building it as a nights and weekends passion project, but at some point, I think in the fall, I just like really started to see both the potential for this vision and the level of impact we could achieve. And I also just really felt that the concept deserved a full-time leader to drive it. And so after a lot of soul searching, and I'm not going to lie, some tears and all that stuff, right?
It's not an easy decision, right?
It wasn't an easy decision. I took the leap, right? And there was really like 2 key reasons why I did it, right? Like one, I love our mission and think it's incredibly important and think it could sort of like add to the safety net that's out there in our communities to help each other out through hard times. And then 2, at a more sort of personal and more selfish level, I frankly also loved the intellectual and visceral challenge of just building an organization from scratch. So I actually loved it from a professional perspective as well, in terms of what a great culmination of all the skills I've learned in my 15 years in the hedge industry, and let's go apply it to something that's so focused on social impact. So that's how you and I find each other talking to each other today.
Well, delighted. And I can't wait to share more of your story. And of course, I'm going to do an early plug for the show notes so people can immediately go and learn more about NeighborShare. But for those that don't know, Diana, let's start with that. What is NeighborShare, and maybe describe what the organization does?
Fantastic. So NeighborShare, which you can find us at nbshare.org.
There you go.
So I'll put in the plug. NeighborShare's whole mission is really centered around getting direct help to the people who need it the most when they need it, right? And we do this by empowering what we call our community's frontline heroes. So think, the case managers and social workers at your local nonprofit, the teachers at your schools, like basically, the folks in our communities who intimately walk with our communities and have the pulse on need, when it's happening and when it's slipping through the cracks. And so what NeighborShare does is we partner with these frontline heroes and the local nonprofits that they work at to identify pivotal needs of $400 or less that would otherwise go unmet. And we work with them to get resources directly to those families. And Patton, to give you a sense of the types of needs that we help with, they've kind of fallen into one of 2 main buckets, right? Okay. There's sort of like the bucket of needs that are the ones that can quickly spiral from an emergency into a crisis if not stopped at the right time. So picture that, unexpected $300 car repair, right? That hits a family that's in sort of a stable situation, but a fragile one.
Yes.
Right.
Sort of like $300 would be.
That's a lot, right? If you're making a paycheck to paycheck, you can't afford the $300.
Right.
And then something like that spirals fast, right? Because all of a sudden you've lost your main mode of transportation. That means all of a sudden you're starting to show up at work late. Your job's the type of job where it's 3 strikes and you're out. You can't show up for work late. And that's how sort of like that unexpected $300 car repair that for a lot of folks would be more an annoyance than anything else can actually spiral quickly for that family into something that's actually putting them at risk of being able to pay the bills 3 weeks, 4 weeks from now, right?
Absolutely.
So there's that type of bucket. And then, by the way, how many nonprofits have a fund called Car Repair Fund? No. They don't, right? They don't have that, right? And so there's sort of that type of need. And then the second bucket that's come up a lot are the think of them as like the last mile blockers that's preventing someone from making a meaningful step change in their lives.
Okay.
Right?
What's an example of that? Yeah. What's an example of that?
Give you an example of that. And then this one just really stuck with me because of the small amount of money we were talking about, right? So it was this 17-year-old teenage father that was working with one of our youth program partners, right? And he was working with them to build a career for himself, right? Build a way to earn a steady paycheck so he can support his young family.
Right.
And basically that nonprofit had done their job, right? Which is like they helped him sort of like identify and get this great opportunity to become a security guard, right? Once again, steady source of income.
Yes.
But then they got stuck because this young man, this kid still basically, he needed $125. because he needed $100 to get a security guard training certification, and he needed $25 for bus tickets to get back and forth from those classes. And that's what was preventing him from, taking charge and making some money and supporting his family, right? And so that's where something like a NeighborShare comes in, being $125, we got you. Keep on building, keep on going, keep on sort of empowering yourself to build your life in a great, positive looking direction,
It's
right?
fantastic.
So that's the type of thing that we do.
It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Two quick questions, though, I guess, or one at least immediately. As you and your co-founders were pondering this at that critical juncture of the pandemic, were there examples out there that you studied that you're like, all right, that gave us some ideas? Or was it you didn't see any examples like what you had in mind? Now, talk a bit about the origin, I guess, of NeighborShare as a concept.
Absolutely. So, the original sort of inkling and spark of the idea came from my co-founder, this wonderful man named Brian Kreider. And he sort of like got the insight from his 20 years of just deep involvement in the social impact space. So he was connecting dots all along. And then once we started, decide to create NeighborShare, we did do, to your point, Patton, a bunch of research to just study the models out there, right? And there's like a few different areas you can imagine that we studied, right? There's everything from the very much sort of like direct aid space, right? So like the give wells of the world where they, basically their model, they raise a bunch of money and then they, get the cash out directly to folks, right? So that was like a particular model. We also studied a lot of like the GoFundMe model, right? Which is like pure crowdfunding, but a place where anybody can raise a need and whatever it is, and then, hopefully raise money to go fulfill their thing.
Right.
And then we also studied similar models to us, but that were focused on different types of missions, right? So the big one for us that I would love for NeighborShare to be one day is Donors Choose.
Okay.
Right, where it's sort of like basically they have the same model as us, but they're partnering with teachers to fund classroom projects, right? And we're basically that model, but we're saying, hey, we're partnering with a different sort of subset of community frontline heroes and identifying a different type of need. And so, but what we basically did was we did a bunch of research, networked our way into them as much as we could, and then talked to them a lot about lessons learned, what worked, what didn't, and whatever else, and then used all of that to come together to build build NeighborShare and design NeighborShare in the way we did.
Yeah, I love that.
And,
you distilled the research into your, but it still created a unique, I guess, a unique organization at the end.
I think that's right. And, and then it's sort of like, and it was like building off of, gaps that we saw in what existed. Right. And so,
I was going to ask you.
Yeah. Cause it's sort of like, if you think about the NeighborShare model, right, where we're, partnered with these frontline heroes, we then present the needs in a certain way on our site, et cetera. It boiled down to two key reasons why we did what we did, right? Which was, one, once again, we started this problem statement of like, how do we just get some help to the folks who need it in our communities? At the moment they need it, right? And then when you really stop to think about it for a second, identifying real-time needs at that individual grassroots level down in each neighborhood is actually really hard, right? You can't actually do that as a typical donor or community member walking down the street. You need integrated boots on the ground to do that. Right.
Yes,
and so that's why we basically, as I think about our network of partner organizations, I almost think of them as that's our army, that's our boots on the ground. They have their fingers in the tendrils of the community and they know when those needs are happening. Right. And then the second key reason is that, we saw value in injecting basically this layer of trust into the whole ecosystem. Right. Sort of an issue with a GoFundMe is that that anyone can post, right? It's sort of like unless I know when I receive them, it's unless I already have a personal connection with that person and whatever it is, I can't really tell the provenance of where that came from, right? Right. Versus, we wanted to create this ecosystem where as a donor, for example, if you were, viewing a need and whatever it is, you can really have confidence that look, every single need that's posted has been validated by a third party on the ground, right? Who's not only saying this person is real, who's also saying, by the way, this need is real. And then lastly, by the way, not only is this need real, I'm also vouching for the fact that this is a need of last resort, right? That I've tried, as a case manager, I'm working on it, right? I'm getting, whatever resources I have, government help, local donors I have, et cetera. We're already working all the programs that we have. And then this is the thing that's still slipping through the cracks, right? So that was that extra layer that we wanted to add in there as well.
Well, I love that. And I guess that's the adaptability of the model though, right? So if you brought NeighborShare to Charlotte, where I am, that those heroes on the ground are essential to determining the gaps here in Charlotte versus where you are or versus any other community in the US or around the world. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And it's so interesting. And like, we're still like relatively small in proof of concept stage, but even at our current size, you can see, to your point, Patton, like the different trends and different like in different types of needs that flow through depending on time of year and what's happening.
Right.
Right. Like over the summer, for example, when those heat waves were happening in the different parts of the country, like we were getting more requests from them for, help paying really high air conditioning bills that people couldn't afford, or that, $100 air conditioning repair, or that, so like a lot of like heat wave related things.
Seasonal,
And then,
right.
yeah, seasonal type things, right? And then more recently, especially with Omicron hitting, sort of like we're definitely from like the areas where the spikes were highest, like we're definitely getting requests from folks who, were suffering through the like, hey, I had to like be out of work for 2 weeks while I had COVID.
Right.
And I didn't get a paycheck during that time. And now I'm at risk of not making my rent. And so like with us inserting at that right moment, we help them get on back on track real fast versus once again spiraling and spiraling, and then you just fall more and more behind, right? And so you can definitely see the regional trends, the seasonal trends, all of that. Because once again, this is also grassroots and individualized. And it really is dependent on, to your point, what the frontline heroes are seeing on the ground in their particular community.
Well, and I know the answer to this because you've created a learning organization, but I'm guessing, are you getting the real-time feedback from this model so that you are even more effective next year in the summer season or whatever season? I'm just curious how you've created, let's call it a learning type organization.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. And then there's, by the way, still so much more for us to figure out, right?
Yeah,
Like the journey
right,
is just beginning.
Right.
It's like totally not done yet. But
Right.
yes, absolutely. Like I think one of our most valuable quote unquote assets as an organization is our partner network,
Yes.
right? And we make sure we actually just completed a round of just reconnect conversations one-on-one with each of our organizations to make sure we were capturing the feedback on the ground of like what's working, what's not, how can we improve our technology, how can we improve our services to you? Because at the end of the day, this thing doesn't work without them, and it doesn't work if it doesn't work for them, right? And so it's sort of like
love that.
we're in this constant mode of like, give us feedback, trust us, you won't offend us, it'll only help us. And we're also in this constant mode of like, I call it like just failing fast, right? Because in my mind and in my sort of concept, like, especially at this early stage of a company, and we've been around for, a year and a half at this point.
Right.
We like failing fast and failure in of itself is not failure. Right? Because the goal right now is to learn.
It's learning. Yes.
Right?
Indeed.
The goal right now is to get data and then go figure out your next pivot and your next move. And so it's sort of like, even though we're calling it failing fast, I'm like, no, it's like, by the way, I prefer failing fast than failing slow. Like, let's get the data and then we can figure out the next round, right? And so that's sort of like our whole attitude as an organization as we try out different things, and some things have worked great and others they don't. Like, and then you scrap it to the side and you do the next pivot for sure.
There's a lesson there. And again, I agree with you. Let's not use failing fast, even though that I understand that kind of terminology, but it's learning fast.
It's
and
learning
adapting
fast. That's actually a better positive spin on it. Yes, that's right.
You are indeed. And well, let's go back to the startup phase of 18 to 24 months ago, I guess, because again, there are a lot of early stage nonprofit leaders listening to this. I'm curious, as you think back, what are some of the lessons learned when you were kind of just getting things started?
Yeah, I mean, it's so I think there were a few sort of like high level lessons, and then there's
Right.
of course all the specifics of like every single, I mean, it's like we can go on for hours, Pat, in terms of like every single thing I had to learn in terms of how to build something from scratch, right?
Right,
But in
right.
terms of like the more meta lessons almost, like and one of our awesome board members, John Kaplan, he actually coached me on this. He's like, Diana, as you're building a startup like this, you need to go in with sort of like a childlike curiosity and open-mindedness to learn. Because you're going into a world where no one knows the right answer. And so you should embrace that with sort of like joy and wonder and excitement, and don't be scared of that. Right? Because I think a lot of us, like we come from, like we're overachievers. We like to achieve. We like to know the right answers. That's how we've been rewarded in school, all that stuff. And you go into a situation like that and you might approach it with fear, but fear will slow you down. Right? Versus freeing your mindset and saying, well, it's okay if I don't know the answer, because by the way, no one knows the right answer. So it's sort of like, like that's okay. Got it. Like, that's great. And then sort of like get yourself in the right mindset to your point. I like the turn on the phrase that you did, Patton, to learn fast.
Right.
Go in that route. And so I think having that mindset is so, so important, because this stuff is hard. Right? Like, when I've like heard my, founder friends talk about like the loneliness of the founder journey and the extreme up and downs and all those things, like you hear it and then, geez, it's still a different thing to experience it. right? And I've gone through all of those, like the loneliness of it sometimes, like the extreme ups, like hooray, and then extreme downs, like, oh, I'm like in tears, like that thing
It's
didn't work
hard.
out. Like it's really hard, right? So I think going in with that right mindset and building the right sort of almost like network and mentors around you to help reinforce that mindset is one of the most important lessons I've learned, right?
That's
Because like the other thing that I've also learned is no, like, or for the most, let's call it 99% of the overnight successes you see aren't overnight successes.
exactly
They
right.
all went through the grind, right? And so I think I had to like learn that calibration for myself as well, where it's sort of like, I'm like, yeah, roar, intense startup, like, let's go. Like, you know, and it's sort of like, yeah, of course we're going to work hard and pivot fast and all these things. But it's sort of like, I had to also learn, and this was like from another mentor I spoke with, and she was just like, I've had to learn to just give time.
Interesting. What do you
Right?
mean? Wait,
That
just
doesn't
the
mean to not
patience
work
of
hard.
okay.
That doesn't mean to not work hard and to, you know, like go fast and all those things. But there's also the like the point of like sometimes you just got to give time. It's almost like the notion of like, you know, when you plant that seed and you're waiting for the tree to grow, it just literally takes time. So
Exactly.
like sometimes it just takes concepts to marinate and things to try out. And like we're right now we're, you know, approaching potential strategic partners and stuff. And I'm like, geez, like that takes patience, right? Because it takes like a month to get in the door, and then you get that great, exciting 30-minute call, and then you have to wait another 4 weeks to get back in the door. Like it's like
Takes
it's sort of
forever.
but by the way, in each of those 3-4 week sprints, I'm actually learning a ton so that I'm actually better prepared for the next call. And so there's like a little bit of like, it's like been this interesting balance, especially for like a type A personality like me,
Right.
where it's like, how do you balance like your intensity and moving fast and growing fast and all these things with also just learning wise patience,
That's
right? Because you need
such good.
both. You need both, right?
Such good advice. And in fact, you represent something I've seen, and I'll get your feedback on this, Diana, that sometimes very talented type A personalities, perhaps like yourself, come from the for-profit world where they are successful. They're used to an accelerated pace, and they think that, you know what, I can apply what I've learned here and I can take it to nonprofit. And then sometimes very disappointed. So it sounds like you got good advice that, hey, don't expect it to happen overnight, but would you agree that sometimes well-intentioned for-profit talent individuals struggle when they try to jump into nonprofit?
Yeah, I do think there's like a recalibration that probably needs to happen a little bit. But at the same time, I'd also encourage folks to like not lose that essence and that core,
Good.
right? Because like sort of like based on what I've seen in the nonprofit world, like look, like we can all use a bit more urgency and faster pace and all those things, right? It's just that just know that you're not going to help reshape an industry overnight, which is where you learn the patience and stuff. But it's sort of like, you know, I'm not saying like, and like, by the way, I've met so many passionate leaders in the nonprofit world who are just as intense, just as hardworking, just, you know what I mean? So I don't want to give
Good.
that impression of like, oh, it's
Yeah.
just like a
Not
different thing.
generalize either
It's not a
side.
generalized right. So it's sort of like, it's
Right.
just much more like there's like definitely like a recalibration piece. And then there's like a piece where like I think it like my part about the giving time also exists in the for-profit world as well, which is like
Good
there's just
point.
certain things that just takes time to gel, right? Or it's like I had to learn how to work with engineers to build technology, and it's like, wait, you mean that simple saving feature takes like 6 weeks to go build? Like you know, like it's sort of like you just learn like all the different
Same thing.
pieces of like what it means to have to build, you know?
Hey, have you found resistance from any in the nonprofit community? Like, who are you to come in to our world and tell us what to do? Or is that
Yeah.
me just
Yeah, I
guessing?
think that's a great question. And the answer is yes.
Okay.
You know, like I would say that especially in the beginning, we faced a lot of resistance and learned a ton as a result of that, right? And I would say at this point, after conversations with dozens, if not hundreds, of organizations and EDs at this point, you know, I would certainly say that I've like developed a lot more empathy about how nonprofit leaders think and how they have to weigh decisions and all those things, right? And, you know, to give you a bit more color, like there were sort of like a few different types of resistance that we faced,
Okay.
right? Sort of like first there was sort of like the generic startup woes.
Right.
As I'm reaching out, they're like, wait, who are you guys? Like, are you a scam? Like, why can't I
Yeah.
find much about you online? What do you
Right.
mean you have zero track record? Like all of those things. Like that's just like, you know, what you get for starting an organization. You know, there's a second bucket that was definitely just like a wariness of like, just sort of like new businesses offering services that sound too good to be true,
Okay.
right? They were very much like, wait, so are you guys still just trying to make money from us in some way? They're like, we get approached by like, you know, 5 new like tech startups a day being like, we're here to sell this great service to nonprofits. And like, they make it seem like they're there to help us, but they're actually for-profit companies. And like, when it sounds too good to be true, we've learned that it is too good to be true, right? So like a lot of like wariness in that way, right? Where like, and after like now understanding the market there a lot better, I'm like, oh, wow, like it is true. Like there are a ton of organizations out there building products and looking to make money from nonprofits.
Sadly, but true. Yep.
Right. And so it's sort of like, okay, got it. Like now I deeply, much more empathize with that wariness. Right. A third, and this was like a really important bucket for us. It's sort of like, I came to more deeply appreciate the more sort of like embedded, like structural issues we were facing. Right. I kind of like went into this space, frankly, like kind of naive. Right. I was like, Pat, all I want to do is provide this additional resource, like easy, right? Like who would say no to that, right?
Right.
It sounded easy enough. And then like, but I came to appreciate after, once again, talking to a lot of folks and doing the research that our model is actually fairly disruptive to the traditional nonprofit model.
Interesting.
Right? Like most nonprofits are designed to say, hey, we fundraise centrally, then we fund our programs, that's our scope, and then you rinse and repeat. Like that's what we do.
Yes.
And then we're saying, we love that you're doing that. Like we want to celebrate that, but we want to add an additional supplement, which is in addition to what you're doing, can you also act as a conduit for us and be that identifier of the need on the ground and then help us ultimately get the funds we get to use straight back out to that person in need, right? So it's sort of like, it's not feeding into your programs, not feeding into whatever. It's like a direct resource out to your clients.
Enhancing the client experience directly, right?
Exactly. And so that's very different, right? Like some orgs like, whoa, like that seems like mission slip to us. How do we think about that? Others were like, hey, we love the concept, but like, oh geez, like we need to figure out how to implement it. Like that's going to take like org redesign or something. Like who's going to do what? Like that's not how we're built, right? So like I came to just like much more deeply appreciate sort of like simple concept, but then what's it going to take on the ground, right? And then last but not least, I think I've also just developed, like, once again, that word empathy keeps on coming back, like just like a much deeper empathy about the realities of running a nonprofit on the ground, right? Where like a lot of us are resource constrained, capacity constrained. And so it's this notion of like, hey, NeighborShare, like, even though you're a good thing, you're another thing on my long list of things that we don't have enough capacity to do.
Gotcha.
Right? Like that's very real. Right? And so on our end, we're like, okay, got it. Like, how do we make this as streamlined as possible? How do we cut the red tape? How do we make the tech stream? Like all these things, right? How do we make it so that it's really hard to turn us down because we want it to be as easy as like you're picking up the bat phone and being like, NeighborShare, I need help. Right? How do we make it so that even for the resource constrained nonprofits, who by the way are oftentimes the people who need us the most, how do we make the barrier to entry basically for them as low as possible so that they can still take advantage of the resource we're building for them? So as you can see, I can go on and on for that all day because that was like months long journeys, like multiple months of journeys learning. So like, like why wasn't this working as well as we wanted? Why were we getting resistance, et cetera? And then now seeing sort of like the landscape with much more richness and depth in terms of all the angles of this thing.
But each one of those angles are relevant. And I think a lot of nonprofit leaders listening could apply an element of that, a kernel of that to their kind of current strategic environment. Well, let me ask you about your kind of personal leadership skills and experience. Clearly, you had much of that. And I'm wondering what transferred as you went kind of from for-profit to nonprofit, or were there any surprises like, wow, there's something I didn't realize I would need to do in this different kind of role?
Yeah, I would say, if you think about our sort of like the tool belt that we develop as executives, right? If you split them between sort of like abilities, which are sort of like just ingrained sort of like approaches to things versus like skills, which is like specific knowledge or specific whatever.
Yep.
I would say that basically like all the abilities that I built in the for-profit space applied over here.
Good.
Right? 'Cause you're just building a business.
Yes.
Strategic thinking, how do you break down decisions? How do you motivate a team? All of those are basically the same. The stuff that I had to like learn a ton on is then applying it into this specific space and then also learning a ton more like just different skills, right? Like for example, like I came in, I didn't know how to fundraise for nonprofit. And it was like so interesting, like our board, they also had to learn that, right? We rapidly learned and were humbled by that. Geez, fundraising the for-profit space sure is different than the nonprofit space.
Right. Exactly. Right.
It's like you're appealing to different motivators. Your pitch needs to be different. You have to have a different level of expectations. There were all sorts of things that we had to learn that were specific to the nonprofit space.
Okay.
I call those skills.
Yes.
right? You could study them, you can whatever, but the leadership abilities and capabilities that you learn and get trained up on in the for-profit space, I'm like literally like I think it's like 100% applied over here as
That's
well.
awesome.
Yeah.
And I think that you're right. A lot of, if someone listening thinking about making a similar jump could have some confidence that, yeah, this will apply. But I also recognize, Diana, you've been good about, hey, I'm also self-aware enough to know there's some things I will learn, and you're a quick study. So I'm guessing you now are much more comfortable in the fundraising space. Not that you weren't immediately comfortable, but you're learning fast, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of this has been definitely, drinking from a fire hose, right? It's sort
Right.
of like and I do think it's really important to approach new spaces with this notion of like knowing what you don't know,
Yeah.
right?
That,
Because like knowing that is power. Like
what good
admitting
point.
what you don't know is power,
Self-awareness, right? Or is that's the
right?
phrase I often use that.
That's right. Because then from there, then you can do something about it. There's no shame in
Indeed.
not knowing.
Indeed.
Right?
You're
Because then
willing
you're
to
like, okay,
learn.
great. Who can I call to give me advice? Google is awesome. I'm best friends with Google these days, right? Like there's lots of great articles and things out there to pick up the 101s for like whether it's fundraising or marketing or like how do I build, I have a personal social media. Wow, it's like completely different and way more sophisticated when you're trying to build a social media account
That's
for an
right.
organization. So I'm like, okay, I'm like studying that social media 101. It's like absorb, and then, while not forgetting all the great skill sets you've gained in your previous career journeys and whatever else. And then it's all about blending it in.
Yeah, love that.
Yeah.
Well, and speaking of something you've developed remarkably well, that perhaps is not as applicable in the for-profit world, is volunteer management, right? And you all have done some wonderful things because obviously you are almost exclusively a volunteer-run organization. So could you talk about some of the keys to how you have built and maintained an effective volunteer program?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say that the strength and level of talent of our volunteer team is probably like one of the proudest things about this organization that I've built. I'm
Understandable.
really proud of the team that we have. And, and then to give folks a sense, I would say we have between 20 to 30 volunteers across the country at any particular point in time, depending on need, not including our board members and advisors and things like that. And, I think there's like a few different elements to it, right? There's like one, which is like, and by the way, these are all lessons from my for-profit world,
Yeah,
right?
good.
Sort of like, and if anything, it's like all the lessons from the for-profit world, but put it on like steroids, basically, because now you're trying to do it for talent that you can't pay.
Right.
So it's that much
Right.
harder, but the psychology and everything is the same, right?
Exactly right.
So, like I think first and foremost is like thinking really crisply and clearly about what your value proposition is. Right? Like recruiting a volunteer, they're providing you something, but you got to provide them something back.
Right.
Right. And so for us, I think there were like three key elements to our value prop. There was one, and every nonprofit will have this, right? Which is like really important, compelling mission, right? At the end of the day, your mission, of course, needs to sing for the volunteer you're speaking with.
Yes, indeed.
Secondly, for us, it was sort of like a big thing around professional development, right? Where like basically because we are startup and entrepreneurial and scrappy, we're able to do two things for our volunteers. One, we're able to help them scratch that startup itch.
Yes.
Right. For everyone who's like, oh, like I kind of want to do this thing, but I need my paycheck and my steady job and all that. Like, we're like, great, you don't need to quit your day job. Come just build this. Just come build this with us. It's the same damn thing. Just come do it.
Exactly.
And then secondly, we also like gave a lot of our volunteers sort of like the developmental opportunity to step up. Right. Sort of like if you're, junior VP in marketing at your firm, I'm like, come to NeighborShare and be our head of marketing. By the way, none of us know what, like, no one else knows what to do. You know more than us. Like, just go for it, right?
Take over, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So you give them this ability to like stretch and take risks and build and create in a way that they might not have in their day jobs, in a way that I think is like very fulfilling, right? Fulfilling, and you learn a ton, right? Because I'm giving them free sort of reign to go experiment and whatever. Because it's sort of like, what's the risk? We don't have anything anyways. Like
build those muscles, right? Build those professional muscles
and be brave, right? And then I think the last part of our value prop is that we have this very explicit policy almost of like, we help each other pay it forward. Right. So with our network of advisors, board members, now other volunteers and previous volunteers, et cetera, like we help each other out. Like I've written, I don't know how many at this point, business school recs, done job references. Folks have, talked to our board members to get career advice. Like we are here to help each other out. Like we are a community with a capital C.
Love that.
And that's really important, right? And so it's sort of like, I think in this volunteer type of setup, it can't just be, what do you got for me? It has to be a two-way street. And I do think that just the compelling mission alone is probably not going to be enough, right? Because like everyone has too many things going on, right? And there's lots of compelling missions out there, right? So sort of like, what's that edge? What's that edge that you have as an organization that you can provide to your volunteers?
That's such a good takeaway, because you're right. Every nonprofit website you and I would go to right now has some nice poetic mission statement on there. But do they have a compelling volunteer value proposition? I would say they don't. And I hope everybody listening thinks about, is there a value proposition for the volunteer experience? And I guess not every nonprofit has the same opportunities to volunteer, but I'm struck by what you did. There always are some opportunities for volunteers, and are nonprofit leaders allowing for that?
Always. And then I've certainly come to appreciate that. And it was funny, I was like joking with a friend about this yesterday because, she's building something as well. And it's like, especially like as you're building like a, an organization all the way around, like you need so many different skill sets and expertises.
Right.
You need HR, you need lawyers, you need the social media expert, which is actually different from your PR expert. You need the technology, you need the product, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, we would never be able to afford that staff. Right.
Exactly.
And then we're also at the size where we actually kind of don't need a full-time one of those or all of them. And so like, I would argue that probably every nonprofit out there, especially if they're earlier on, probably can use some expert volunteer help.
Indeed.
In those slices, if they think about it in that way. Right. And then one last thing I'll say about this volunteer thing in terms of like, there's like, the motivating and the retaining, like a huge other element that we do is like, we create ownership for our volunteers. Right? Where it's sort of like when you volunteer at NeighborShare, and by the way, I've like fired volunteers before, I've rolled them off before, whatever it is, it's sort of like, you're not coming in. It's not the type of volunteering where you like get a task done. Like you're here for an hour, you feel good, you pat yourself on the back and
go home. Right.
Right. You come in and you take on responsibility.
Good
like
way to put it.
You're here to build with me. You're here to own the organization with me. And so even though that bar becomes higher for accepting in volunteers, once people come in, they're bought in and they're owning it with you.
Is there a term, Diana? Sorry to interrupt you. So if I come in to volunteer, I guess subject to my performance, you keep me around, or how do you express kind of the commitment when somebody joins the team?
Yeah, I mean, I have this conversation with them up front, right? Yeah. On, hey, like we're kind of different. And, when you're coming on here, like you're here to problem solve with me. You're here to, get stuff done with me. And it's sort of like, so there's like that level of commitment. At the same time, we have a ton of flexibility.
Okay.
Right. Like at the same time, you need to recognize that, look, like we're probably every volunteer's 5th, 6th, 7th priority, right? Yeah. They have day jobs, family, spouses, but like all these things, right? So it's sort of like, let's not lose sight of that at the same time.
Right.
Right. And so then there's like definitely this like flexibility and balance and empathy that we create where it's sort of like, hey man, like if you're having like a really tough week at work or like whatever it is, like I get it. It's going to be slower on the NeighborShare side.
Just
right.
Let me know, right? Or be let me
know. Like the key thing is let me know. But it's sort of like I get it, and it's sort of like of course we practice accountability with each other, but it's like flexible in that way, right? I'm not going to be the CEO who's like, you promised this at 2 p.m. Where like it's like no, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way, right? Once again, I'm not paying you, and you have other responsibilities. So there's still that like even though we get in sync upfront on the commitment and the ownership and whatever, there's real flexibility. And I've definitely had volunteers who've come in, done a ton of great work, then they have to disappear for like 3 months.
Yeah. Life happens.
It just hit me. I can't do it, etc. And then they'll come back in, right? And so it's sort of like I've had to learn to sort of like deal with that type of sort of like turnover and volatility in a way that's like smoothed out, right? Like in the beginning, I used to get like really sad, right? It hit me emotionally, like, oh, like this person's off the team, like what, like like that, what I mean? And then I'm like, oh, they might come back, by the way.
Yeah.
And by the way, it's not personal,
forever.
Right? It's just like other things going on. So you just learn that, and then you also learn like I've learned to build up enough of a bench that you just learn how to move the pieces around. Oh, like so-and-so is like out for the next month. Oh, let's pull this person back in. Let's see if we can get some out. You just like learn to be really scrappy, and you're just constantly making the puzzle pieces move around to hopefully, still maintain pace and movement forward. Right?
You utilize other talent that you've connected to.
And then there are moments where there is a gap, right?
Right.
But in a way that's like really no different than staff, where like sometimes staff quits and you're like, oh no, I have a gap. I got to go hire and make up, it's like, it's really not that different at the end of the day.
Right. Diana, this is fantastic. I want to ask you one more conceptual question.
Yeah.
Strategic planning. You brought skill and experience in strategic planning to this role. Talk about how you've approached strategic planning as a startup nonprofit.
Yeah, I mean, like I continue going back to the phrase that we keep on talking about, right? Which is like this notion of the fail fast and pivot.
Yeah, good.
Right. I joke that like I have not put together like a 6 month or even a 3 month plan that I've carried all the way through. It's like by month two, we've probably pivoted in some way.
Right.
Right. And so it's sort of like I certainly found the value in being strategic and being clear about here are our top priorities for the next quarter, top priorities for the next 6 months and whatever it is. But then there's like, certainly learned this like constant sort of like flexibility to say, let's make sure we're keeping our eyes open to the data and reactions we're getting on the ground so that we can adjust that strategy as we go as needed. Right. Because this is very much like an exercise and you're flying the plane while you're building it. Right. And so it's sort of like it's that flexibility that really that I've really sort of inserted into sort of how I would traditionally strategic plan, right? Where like the cadences there are just slower, right? They're just slower because like by default, you probably have a sure view going in on what the plan is, how long you're going to invest, et cetera. And then we just do faster cycles basically.
So you're not taking your leadership volunteers onto a retreat to talk about a 5-year plan?
No, I don't think we're ready for
your time horizons are just simply shorter.
Yeah, I think it's months versus years right now because we're still in this mode of like trying some big experiments and hypotheses to sort out sort of what our like ongoing really organizational model and business model will be, right? Sort of like we're not fully there yet, so we're sorting that through. And like I do think sort of like let's call it by mid-year or something, we probably will be right for like let's do a full step back, do some type of retreat with the board, like that type of thing, and like look at all our data, look at what we learned, et cetera, and be ready for the next bigger pivot, right? Because there's like small pivots you make day to day on the ground, and then there's bigger strategic pivots that would merit sort of like that type of step back type of thing.
Clearly, you've been successful in kind of putting a dream together, you and your co-founders. Do you allow yourself now to dream on occasion? Maybe it's driving somewhere or where you have time to reflect, but where do you see NeighborShare going? It just seems to have potential, but is it too early to even think about that?
Yeah, I mean, like I think my dream for NeighborShare is that, like through time we become sort of an organization that's out there as an additional resource to all the really fantastic nonprofits that are doing the real hard work on the ground.
Yes.
Right? Like beauty would be that, the NeighborShare resource is reaching, every corner of every 50 states as, once again, that notion of that bat phone that our frontline heroes can call, right? Because it's sort of like we're a service to the existing awesome people out there doing the hard work who've been there for decades, who understand the communities and whatever it is. And so I think for us to figure out a way to sustainably scale and get that reach and get our tendrils into every organization and every sort of local community out there. Like I think that would be the dream.
It's
right?
a complementary
thing. It's a supplemental thing. None of this sort of is a critique of the industry, much more like a recognition that like there are gaps need slip through. And so how do we just create that extra layer in the safety net while recognizing that all those other layers sure are necessary as well. Right.
It's fantastic. And as everything you shared in this conversation, Diana, lots of wisdom, lots of advice and takeaways for our listeners. If someone is listening and pondering perhaps a path like you've taken over the last few years, any advice or anything else you would add to
I
get them to think about it?
Yeah, like, and especially for those who are like, hey, should I do this? Should I not? Like my main encouragement is like, go do something. Like dip your toe in, right? It doesn't need to be this gigantic leap of like, I'm quitting my job and changing my career and whatever. Like it's sort of like, get started, right? And that could be as easy as, like go volunteer for a local org. But once again, I would encourage you to not volunteer necessarily at the task level versus like go speak with the leadership there. Like figure out like, how can I help strategically? How can I get into the inner working so I can like experiment and add my values and skill set, et cetera. And from that experience also learn, right?
Great advice.
But it's sort of like, it's like the main thing is like, keep your barrier to entry low. Just go do something, right? Like I probably spent also years like, oh, like I would love to be on a board, like, oh, I should give back more to the community. I get sort of like all these things, and then I was always too busy, too whatever, and like, then like insecurity is like, I don't know if I deserve to be on a board, like all those things, and it's sort of like take away those excuses and do something small.
Great
like
advice.
Tomorrow, like there's literally nothing like slowing down from tomorrow, right? And then from there you'll learn and like gain confidence and gain traction, and then you'll also then have more confidence in deciding whether or not you want to take that leap or not. And there's no judgment either way, right?
Absolutely right. And
Right.
there's such good advice. But I like your distinction there. Certainly, there are good volunteer opportunities where you show up on a Saturday morning and do something and go home.
Which is also really important, by the way, which is
Exactly.
really important. But this is, this advice was for those who might want to take that leadership path into the nonprofit space. That's
That's
right.
100% right. Spot on. Well, Diana, this is fantastic. Again, as I mentioned, lots to ponder for our listeners. As you know, I ask for a parting gift from every guest. Talk about a book maybe that's been meaningful to you that you would share with our listeners.
Absolutely. I would really recommend the book, The Lean Startup by Eric Rice, Ries. That was a book I read early on in this NeighborShare journey, and it helped me a lot in terms of just developing sort of like the right mindset and mental maps, right? So a lot of this, the things I've been sharing here, even in terms of like the failing fast and pivoting, how do you think about that? How do you hypothesis driven? Like it came from this book and the fundamental principles behind how do you go about building and growing a startup. So highly recommend it.
Love it. It's on the shelf behind me. And it's not, for our listeners who may not be familiar, it's not a nonprofit book, but your point is a good one. It's still very applicable to many nonprofits are like startups. And that's why that book is so relevant to you and I think to others.
That's right. You're building a business.
Right.
At the end of the day, we're all running businesses. That's
exactly.
Right. It's just a different tax status. That's right.
Exactly.
That's right.
All right, Diana, where can people go to find out more about you and the great work you're doing at NeighborShare?
Thanks, Patton. So our website is nbshare.org. And you can also find us on social media. On Instagram, we're at NeighborShare. And then you can also find us under the same name on Facebook and LinkedIn as well.
I can't wait to put all this in the show notes and would encourage our listeners to find where Diana is and the great work she's doing at NeighborShare. And Diana, thank you again for joining me on the path.
Thank you, Pat. This was such a pleasure. I had so much fun.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Diana as much as I did and came away with some practical ideas that can help you on your journey in nonprofit leadership. And perhaps even more importantly, think about how you're going to attract, orient, and engage critical volunteers that are important to your organization. Don't forget the show notes. This is episode number 151. Go to our podcast page or the news page at pattonmcdowell.com, and you can find out more about Diana and the great work she's doing through NeighborShare, and maybe get more insight as to what it's like to be a lateral entry into nonprofit leadership. Speaking of leadership development, don't forget about our mastermind program. The application portal is open right now. We've got 2 groups coming together this summer and 2 more in the fall. So check it out, pattonmcdowell.com mastermind. Find out more and see if it might be a good fit for you, and we'd love to have you join other leaders from around the country. If I can ask you one more favor, make sure you share this episode with one other person on the path. You can also assure that you're not missing any of these episodes. If you go to the podcast page at pattonmcdowell.com, make sure you hit the follow button. Follow equals subscribe, and you will get a weekly email which assures every episode will be downloaded right into your device and for your listening pleasure. Thanks once again for all you're doing in the nonprofit sector, especially right now, and keep up the good work for causes that are most meaningful to you. I'll keep bringing you content that can help you do it even better. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time on The Path.